Welcome to another tutorial from All Things JavaScript, where we help bridge the gap between novice and expert. In last week's video, we talked about local storage and session storage. As a part of that tutorial, a request was made to also talk about IndexedDB. So let's first look at the differences and then take a look at how we can get started using IndexedDB. So first off, IndexedDB lets you store and retrieve objects that are indexed with a key. So unlike local storage, you can store all types of data. Objects is indicated here. Local storage only lets you store strings. Also with IndexedDB, you can store a lot more data. Now, the data that you store using IndexedDB is retrievable by accessing the same domain. So it uses the same domain policy as local storage. That doesn't change. So as long as you're accessing a web page of the same domain, you can get access to the IndexedDB data. Now, the IndexedDB API is asynchronous. Now, this is quite different from local storage. With local storage, it was like an extended object. You could simply access it and pull the values from it. Since IndexedDB is asynchronous, this means that you need to use the DOM events associated with it to let you know when the data is accessible. So basically, you establish a connection, you wait for it to respond with an event, and then you can continue on. And like I said, that was not the case with local storage. It was like an extended object that you could access. Now, IndexedDB stores data using key-value pairs. So it is object-oriented. That part is similar to local storage, with the exception that IndexedDB allows you to store any kind of data. Now, this is an important thing to be aware of because the DB in IndexedDB refers to database. But it doesn't use column and rows like traditional databases you may be used to. And because of that, there is no need for a structured query language to retrieve the data. Finally, the specification for IndexedDB is still evolving, so be aware of that. Make sure that it is supported when you're trying to use it. Now, before we start coding, let's look at the basic steps we have to follow to use IndexedDB to store and retrieve data. So here they are. First, you open a database. Now, if this is the first time you've opened the database or it's a new version of the database, you have to create an object store for that database. Now, the object store, that basically defines a structure for the data you want to store. It is like defining a table in a traditional database. When the data is placed in a store, it is tracked with a key. So we need to specify what that key is as a part of creating the store. On the success event, so once that event has been received, we can conduct our transactions. And then once we are done with the transactions, we close the transaction. So those steps seem pretty simple. And that's why I wanted to show this ahead, because the concept behind it is simple. So once we get into actual commands, you can attach those to these basic steps that we just looked at, and that will help you remember them. All right, let me jump to Sublime and we'll get started. So first off, I want to show you at the top. Notice this comment at the top. This is the data structure that we're going to be storing. I decided I wanted to store information about questions in a quiz. If I were doing a quiz and I wanted to store all of those and have them available if the user came back to them, and also have them available to determine information about that. And so what we'll be storing is an ID for the question, the text of the question, what the correct answer is, what the student's answer is, and the result. And the result will be either true or false. True if it's correct, false if it's incorrect. Now, the first thing we're doing here in this line is we're just making sure that we can support IndexedDB in different browsers. This may not be necessary, but as it's evolving, it might be a good idea to do. So basically, we're setting window.indexedDB to any one of these. So if a WebKit browser has implemented it with the WebKit preface, we would still be able to use it. Now, something else that you may want to consider if you're planning to use IndexedDB is to make sure that it's supported. And a way you could do that is simply check window.indexedDB. And if it's not supported, then you could give some alert message like that. All right, let's go ahead and start setting this up. Now, I'm going to set these variables up globally. Now, I would recommend that if you're doing this with a project, you don't do it globally. Use one of the patterns that's available so that you don't have to do these globally. In my advanced topics course, I go into quite a bit of detail about these different patterns. I also have a few other tutorials that talk about making sure you're not using global variables. I'll link to all of those in the description section. So here, the first variable we're setting up is request. And what we're doing there is we're opening the database. Now notice what we specify when we open the database. First, IndexedDB is associated with the window object. And then we use the open method that's a part of that. And we indicate the name of the database. So if this database has already been established, it's the name that we used previously. In this case, this will be a new database. And then we indicate a version. So there is a version number you can associate with the database. If you're updating the database, you would change the version number. All right, a couple other variables we'll be using. DB will be the database, TX, transaction, store will be the store from the database, and then finally index. There's a way you can add an index so you can search different pieces of data that you store within the database. Now, this request, when we do indexedb.open, it will return with a response. And so we want to create a handler to be able to handle those events. It could be an error or it could be successful. So to set up the error handler, we would do this. There is an event object which we can receive, and so I used a parameter e to capture that event object. And then I'm just going to log to the console the error. And then I can print out more information about the error by using the event object. Just like that. Now, the event we are really interested in is the onSuccess. So let me enter that one. That is the event that we will use to then work with the database, add data to it, get data from it. So this is the event handler that's going to be most important to us. Now, the first thing I'm going to do with this event handler is assign the database to our DB variable. And we do that by accessing request.result. So the result of this, when we open the database, what is the result of that? Well, on the event onSuccess, we can then get the result and assign it to the database. Another way we could do that is using the event object. But this is easier. All right, now let's pause for just a moment. We have our onError event and we have our onSuccess event. But when you're creating a brand new database, or you're opening a database with a new version, then there is another event that gets fired as well. And that's on upgrade needed. And in that event handler, we need to establish the store. Now, remember, I mentioned the store defines the structure for the data. And so that's what we want to take care of. So let me go ahead and put another handler. And this event is going to be on upgrade needed. All right, let's go ahead and set things up inside of here. So we want to grab the database. So I'm going to do it the same way I did it down below. And then we want to set up a store. And we use the database to do that. And the database has a method, create object store. And then we pass in the name we want to give to that store. And so I'm going to be calling it questions store. Then the second thing we want to pass in is what is going to be the key for this data. This is an important thing to indicate. Now we can choose a key that is just auto-incremented, that whenever we add data, it automatically increments that key. Or we can choose a key from the data we're passing in. Now, if we want to choose a key from the data we're passing in, we would enter key path inside an object. I have my object here, the curly braces. So key path inside an object, and the value associated with it will be the key that we assign to that data when we add data to our database. So when we're adding data to our database, we're going to be adding objects. And they're going to contain this information. And this will be the key to the ID for the question, the key to the question text. This will be the key to the correct answer. This will be the key to the student answer. And this will be the key to the result. So if I want the key to be the ID that I've assigned to the question, then I would need to enter QID like that. Now I said there's another way to set up the key for your store. So let me show you that really quick. We won't use this method, but let me show you how you would do it in case you need to. db.create object store again. And this time, I'm going to do something different. Once I put in the name of the store, so that part remains the same, but in the object I pass into it, this time I'm going to enter auto increment and set that equal to true. And so this will cause the key to be auto incremented each time something is added. So that's another way we could set up that key. Like I said, I won't be using that one, so I'm just going to comment that out. Finally, the other thing I want to set up on this database is an index. Now, for the data I'm passing in, I probably don't need an index. I'm using the ID as a part of the key, so I'll be able to use that ID to retrieve the data anytime I want. But an index would allow me to retrieve data using something else. So for example, if I wanted to retrieve data by entering the text of the question, then I would need to set up an index for that. And so for example, if you were storing names as a part of the data you were storing, you'd probably want to set up an index for the names so you could search on the names. Or birth date. If you were dealing with people, that might be a good type of index to set up as well. So if you want to be able to search on that particular information, you need to set up an index for it. So that's what I'm going to do now. Whoops, I'm still defining variables here. So let me change that to a comma. And then index. And set that equal to store. Now that we have our store created, we can use it to create an index. What do we want to call the index? I'm going to call it question text. And what am I basing it on? Question text. That key, that's what I'm basing it on. And then I can also enter some additional information about the index. For example, is it unique? And I'm going to enter false for that because it's not unique. It's possible we could have two questions that have the same text. That's possible. All right, so this is going to execute. This event will be fired whenever a new database is created. So the first time we execute this, this will happen. It will set up the store. It will set up the index. And then once this is done, then the onSuccess event will fire. So then we can do the rest of our things. Once it's the same database, then it will go directly to onSuccess. So let's look at what we would do in onSuccess then. I've established some variables up here. As I said, these are currently global. You'd want to use a pattern that wouldn't make them global. But for simplicity's sake, that's what I'm doing. Now I want to fill in these variables. That's what I want to do first, because I'm going to use this information to store and retrieve data. So the transaction would be equal to db.transaction. And then I identify the store, the name we assign to the store. We can have more than one store in a database. So I could have a question store. I could also have a learner store that would track the learners, as an example. So right here, I want to get the question store. And I'm specify that it will be read-write, so that I can write data to it and I can read data from it. Let me press return so I can make this easier to see. So that's the transaction. Let's also get a reference to the store. And we get that using the transaction.objectStore and then the name of the store. We continually use that name. And then finally, let's get a reference to the index so that we can use the index if we want to. And we can grab that using the store.index and then the name we gave to the index, question text. All right, with these references, we're able to now work with our database. Now, the first thing I want to do here is I want to put an on-error handler. Whenever I do something with the database, if it causes an error, I want to be able to see it. And then one error that could occur is that the user may not have given permission for you to do this in their browser. That's a possibility. And that would probably show up here with this request error. The DB error will get any error because it bubbles up. DB is at the top level, and so we'll grab any of those errors. And so I just want to put a general error handler so I can see any errors that occur. All right, that's all we need for that. All right, so now let's start putting in information. So let me just copy a few statements to put some question data into our database. And we do that using the store. Remember, we had to establish the store in order so we could put our data in there. So we use store.put, and then we pass in an object. Now notice the object. As mentioned, these are what I'm using as the key to the key value pairs for that object. So the question ID for this first question is 1, then question text, the sky is blue. The correct answer is true. The student answer was true, and the result was true. They got it correct. Okay, so that's one piece of information I'm putting in. Let me do one more. We'll do 2 pieces of information. That should be enough to see how this works. So the second put statement, question ID is 2, question text, the grass is green, and the correct answer is true. The student got this one right as well. So these were 2 true-false questions. All right, now the last thing we want to do is to close the database. So So when the transaction is complete, have a handler for that, db.close. And that will close the database. All right, let's go ahead and save this and see if everything executes properly for us. Let me refresh. I'm just going to open the console, see if I got any errors. Okay, looks good so far. We'll find out if the data was stored properly when we try to retrieve it. So let's take a look at how we do that. Now, I've already stored the data, so I'm going to comment these two lines out. And I'm going to do this process again. I'm going to open the database again to retrieve the data. So this part won't execute again because I'm not creating a new database or a new version. And so I'll go to the onSuccess, and then inside of here, this time I want to retrieve data. So your onSuccess handler is where you're doing the work with the database. So one thing you may want to set up is a function that simply interfaces with that database. And that function will open the database, have the on-error, onSuccess, and then you can pass in what you want to do during that session. And then that's what will happen inside the onSuccess. So just a suggestion there. But let's look at how we would now retrieve data. So first, I'm going to assign this to Q1 variable. And I use the store and I use the get method. And I'm just going to get 1. So this is the key. Whenever we don't use an index, when we just use the store, we specify the key of the data we want to retrieve. So that's what I'm doing here. Now let me show you also how we would use an index. This time we use an index, not the store, and we use the get method as well. And then we pass in the data we're searching for in that index. Let's see if we can get the grass is green, that question. See if I entered that correctly. All right, so these will go out and get those records. However, remember, IndexedDB is asynchronous. Therefore, in order to retrieve that information, we need to set up some handlers. So Q1.onSuccess, we use an onSuccess event again. And then what are we going to do with it once we get it? Well, in this case, I'm just going to log to the console. Q1.result. So the result is what's returned. So that should be the record that's returned. Also, something else we can do. Watch this. We do Q1.result. Since this is an object that I've stored here, I can retrieve something specific from that object using one of the keys. So I'm going to retrieve question text. So those are the two log statements I'll do with Q1. All right, QS.onSuccess. Set that equal to function. And then what we're going to do with that, we'll just console log QS.result. This time we will pull the question text. Instead of the entire object, we'll just get the question text for that. And then once again, on complete, we close the database. So here's how we would retrieve data. Let's save that. See how that works. So there we go. In our first console log statement, we have the first record. Notice we have all the different data that was associated with that. And then using our index, we did enter it correctly, apparently, because it found it, because it returned that record, and then we pulled from it the question text, which is what we're seeing down here. This is the question text from this first record. All right, so that's the basics of getting started with IndexedDB. First off, you want to make sure you're supporting IndexedDB. And then I set up several variables. The request is opening the database, and then we fill in a database, transaction, store, and index. If it's the first time you've accessed that database or it's a new version, then you need to make sure you respond to the on upgrade needed event. And in that, you set up your store, and you can set up indexes if you choose to. If there's an error, you want to make sure you handle that. In the on success event, that's where you do all of your transactions. In order to be able to do that, set up the database, transaction, the store, and the index. And then if you're putting data, you would use put with using store. Getting data, you can use get with store or get with your index. And then you want to make sure you close the database when the transaction is complete. So I hope you found that tutorial helpful. If so, go ahead and give it a like. If you'd like to further add to your JavaScript skills, you can do one of the following. Click the video link in the center to access another tutorial right away. If you haven't subscribed already, click the circle link on the left. I release a new tutorial each week. And if you'd like to visit the All Things JavaScript website for full courses and a complete list of tutorials, click the link on the right. Thanks for watching.